Community Manager for Lyfebulb, and today we're talking about key concepts of caregiving with Grady Stewart, one of our Lyfebulb ambassadors. Grady was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis about 6 years ago and has since become a passionate advocate for patients and healthcare rights. He has written and spoken on the issues and is currently a Crohn's and Colitis Young Adults Network alumni, as well as being a Lyfebulb ambassador. Hi, Grady.
Hi, nice to be here with you today.
Yeah, nice to be with you. Welcome to our Lyfebulb live chat. It's great to have you here talking about caregiving because I am the mother of a young man with ulcerative colitis, and I've always wondered if I am providing the appropriate support that he needs. So let's get right to it, if you don't mind, and let me ask you. I understand that you were in college when you were first diagnosed. How did you feel when you learned that your illness had a name, and how much were you comfortable sharing with your caregivers?
Yeah, that early diagnosis period, especially when you're in a place of great change, like your freshman year of college, is so challenging because prior to being diagnosed, I had never really even heard of ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. I think the only place I might have heard it in passing was from like a commercial on TV, but that's like the bare minimum of information you can possibly have about it. And so when I was first diagnosed, I felt extremely isolated because not only did I know nothing about the disease, I didn't know anyone else with it. So for me, it was challenging to talk to my caregiver, my parents about it, but it was really important that I do so because I didn't have anyone else to talk to at that point. I think it's
Sure.
a very vulnerable disease. Any chronic illness, it takes a lot of courage and bravery to be open and public about it. And at that point, I don't know that I was there in my journey. And also, I just didn't have the resources or the network to do that yet. And so that caregiver support for me was really so essential in showing me that I could be vulnerable about my disease and that I could talk about it with someone and that it wouldn't necessarily change our relationship. But
Right.
I think that like caregiver support is one of the first places you really have to start when you're starting to open up with it, because that's usually they're people that you're very comfortable with. They know you on a very intimate level. So I think they play a really important role, especially in the beginning of diagnosis and even going forward too.
Well, that kind of leads to my next question, which I was going to ask. How involved were your parents when you were diagnosed? Meaning, how much assistance did you actually want from them? Dealing with doctors and tests or whatever you had to do.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's challenging. I think I had a kind of a unique situation because I was at college very early on. And so I was not in the same city as my parents, which added a whole other level to it. And at the same
Right.
time, also part of the purpose of college is to become more independent. It's when you're first starting your adult life, and there's a great emphasis on like learning how to be an adult for the first time. So that brought a lot of complicated emotions for me in that like I was at the very beginning of this new exciting and sometimes scary phase of my life. But then all of a sudden, I immediately had this huge setback where I couldn't necessarily be as independent as I wanted because I couldn't necessarily drive myself to medical appointments because you get put on medications that make you drowsy. I
Right.
couldn't necessarily figure out insurance. I think being that young and having to deal with like accounting 2001 for the first time, like I
Right.
knew very little about the navigating the healthcare system and insurance. So
And truth is, neither did your family probably, but we all have to learn. It's
that's the
hard.
thing. I think it's impossible to do it on your own at first unless you're
Right.
extraordinary, which I'm sure there's people out there, but even for them, it's challenging. So I guess to answer your question, there are times where you definitely want it can be emotional to have to ask for help, and it can be frustrating to have to ask for help, especially when you're not used to it,
Right.
because you want to see yourself as this person who's like self-reliant and who's like capable of doing things on their own. And so asking for help is a very scary thing to do because again, it goes back to having to be vulnerable and having to like expose yourself.
Okay, so I want to know then, given your age, because of just as you said, you're on the brink of this whole independent adulthood, but you have this crisis that has come up. which was more important to you, like on the scale, independence or support in the management of your illness? Meaning if you had to kind of slightly tilt the scale one way or the other.
Yeah, so I definitely think that I would have to say support, because
Okay,
support was the pathway to independence for me. At first, like, I wouldn't have been able to figure out the things that I did if I didn't have that support, if that makes sense.
right.
Like, to put it another way, I guess, I'm very independent now in my care. Like, I know how to talk to pharmacies, I know how to arrange my care. But in the beginning, if I hadn't had that support, I wouldn't have learned that, because it really helps to have someone there to advocate for you in the beginning when you're not necessarily as comfortable talking about your disease. It helps to have,
Yeah,
like, someone by your side who can say, "Hey, my son is not well," or like, "Hey, my friend is not sleeping well or needs a change in their medication." Because when you're
yeah,
new to having to talk about your chronic illness, you may not be able to articulate it the best. And also, I think importantly too, on that note, I think, like, in the beginning, again, like, I knew no one, and so it's very hard to not feel isolated and to not feel like you're completely alone. And when you are feeling completely alone, it's hard to be, like, independent, because you just don't wanna do anything. You're feeling like there's no one else who can understand you. So it's hard to be
yeah.
confident and put yourself out there and, like,
And
start doing things on your own.
and as I'm listening to you and thinking how you're a young man and my son was actually he was a younger teenager when he was first diagnosed, but he's now 23. So I know those are issues. First, let me ask, are both your do you have two parents involved in your support?
Yeah, at the time I did. So
You
it's
did.
actually, it's interesting, because my caregiver experience was really important for me later on, because my dad was later diagnosed with ALS. And so
Hmm,
I had to switch roles, actually.
right. Right. I guess what I was curious to know though was as a young man, did it, I mean, was like the mother being involved because of the intimacy of the nature of IBD versus a father, or did it not matter, because they're both your parents?
That's a tough question. I think they both brought different things to the table, and I
Okay.
think this is different for everyone. I know that my dad was always someone who was very, like, knowledgeable about adulting and adulting relating topics. So he was someone who really knew how to, like, navigate the financial side of things that I was having to
Mhm.
figure out, who knew how to, like, get an appointment set up, like, I guess the logistical side of things,
Right.
but could also provide the emotional support. Whereas my mom was definitely more of, like, they were both vocal about my care, but I think my mom was more of a in front of the camera, in front of the scenes advocate, whereas my dad was more on a one-on-one with me, and, like, fighting to do all the backstage work kind of advocate caregiver, if that makes sense. Whereas my
Sure.
mom was more of, like, come to every single appointment. Because of their lifestyles, my dad was working a lot more at the time,
Yeah.
and also just because of their personalities. But I think those two sides of things are equally important. You really can't have one without the other.
Right. Well, you were lucky you did have both there. So I guess I'd like to know if you had to identify what was the most helpful thing and the least helpful thing that your parents as caregivers did for you or still do for you.
I think, honestly, like, when I was first starting out with treatment, the most important thing they both did was placing such an emphasis on being there for me. So being there to, like, listen, but also to, like, provide support and going to the Office of Disability Services and, like, helping me figure out how to get that aid that I needed.
The
So
bureaucracy, the adult stuff. Yeah.
yes, but also the softer stuff too, like, when you're first starting out, a lot of the treatments that you have to try are very overwhelming, and on top of that, you need, like, it sounds crazy, but there's so much, like, love in the act of a friend or a caregiver
It's not
coming with you to
crazy.
sit for, like, 2 to 3 hours, because you're connected to an IV for 2 to 3 hours, and, I mean, to be frank, it's boring, but it's also very overwhelming and scary, because it's something that you don't expect to be doing, for me at, like, 18 or
I know.
younger, or any age, really. So that act of just sitting there and coming to every doctor's appointment to make sure that you're not, first one, you're not missing anything, because
Right.
it's a doctor's appointments, I think everyone knows, they move quickly. So a lot of times it helps to have someone there taking notes, being involved, because you can't always say everything just because of the speed of conversation. They've got the
Or
next
remember everything,
thing.
right?
Yeah. So that was definitely the best thing they did for me, was just being there in
Okay.
the general sense. And I think on the flip side, and it's kind of related, the most, I guess, damaging thing, or the thing that I disliked the most that they did, and this is very hard and I don't fault them for it, because
Mhm.
I think something that isn't realized as much is that, like, caregivers are very much going through the same experience as the patient in a different way, but it very much impacts them. And sometimes
Yes.
it's hard as a patient for you to realize that, but I can recall being frustrated sometimes that they would, like, worry too much, or they would be overly involved, in the sense that, like, sometimes it
Okay.
felt like they were trying to exert too much control basically over, and not
Okay.
letting me have that independence later on.
Yeah, that's what I feared, I guess. But it's good to know as the parent because we worry, but maybe the trick is how we display that worry. Because certainly as grown-ups, you should be able to hold back how you demonstrate some of that worry. Yeah, and let go some of the control. That's good to know from my end of things too. Um, what advice so I have 2 kind of questions. First, what advice would you offer other parents or caregivers along this journey? Meaning, apart from being supportive, is there something, now having gone through the few years that you have, just kind of that wise piece of advice or general advice you would offer? This is to the parents or caregivers.
Yeah, so one piece of advice, and this kinda goes off the last point that I was just talking about, is I
Mhm.
think it is really important, and again, it's something that's often overlooked, that you also take care of yourself too, and that you do have your own support network. And I know that's not advice relating to caring for someone, but at the
No, it
same
is.
time, it is, because you can't care effectively if you're not prioritizing your own needs and taking care of your own emotional needs. Because, like I said, it really does take an emotional and even physical burden on you, having to, like, stay up and having to worry and be stressed about your loved one's care. So that's something that I
Yeah,
think, again, isn't talked about often, and something that I would really recommend, is that you do have an outlet in some form of self-care support group to connect with other caregivers. Because on top of that too, when you do have that outlet, you're able to, like, gain more information, especially if you are talking to other caregivers, if you are
right.
talking to other patients, it helps your own understanding of the disease and your own, I guess, what you're doing in your own caregiving, to go and talk to other people who are going through the same thing.
And
And
it's
again, it helps with
actually
isolation.
And it is great advice, and it's something the parents don't think about. And back when I was going through the worst of my scenario with my son, Lyfebulb didn't exist. And if there were other platforms, I did not know about it. And now, as I see, especially as we're working on the release of IBD Life and Lyfebulb in general, I wish this had been here when I was the parent going through it at the worst, because this would have been the greatest place for that. So that's really good. So I guess the last question is on that same ilk, what advice would you offer patients when they're going through this in how they, respond to their caregivers?
Yeah, I think, going again off this
Mhm.
thread, I think the advice I would give is to realize that they are also going
Mhm.
through a lot of the same emotional wins and losses that you are. So I think the best advice I can give is that there are times when you're going to have to, like, stand up for yourself and advocate without them. And it's important that you have the ability to do that and be independent. And then
Yeah.
there's also times where you need to treat it like a partnership, and realize that it is okay to ask for help, and that you need to get people more involved, because it might be impossible to do something by yourself, or maybe you're just overburdened at that time. But at the
Yeah.
same time, I think, like, if you are going to do that, you have to realize that it's a partnership, and you have to realize that they're also dealing with the worries of it, dealing with the stress of it. So I think it's a balance between being independent and knowing your boundaries and being able to set those boundaries and
Yeah.
being able to be independent and then also being able to ask for help.
Well,
So
that is
again,
really
I think
great advice. And I have to say, I wish you luck with your new role also now as a caregiver regarding your father. So I guess you're seeing both sides of it, and hopefully you'll still take care of, especially take care of yourself.
yeah, no,
Well,
definitely. It's been I wish I had this insight now earlier in my journey as a caregiver because I think it would have helped me understand things better too, and maybe I could have been a better patient for having had the caregiving experience as well.
well, it's an ongoing process, so you will continue to be a good patient and caregiver, I'm sure. So I want to thank you. We're always grateful to our life bulb ambassadors for all their input. And thank you, Grady, again for your time. This has been really nice.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and for presenting this really interesting and important topic.
Well, good. Okay.